star, and I was a nobody, you know. And I used to go into the mess and play his records all the time. But I didn't realize that one day I would meet this man and we'd become friends.
It started long before the Vegas lights, before the rhinestones, before the applause that could drown a man's own heartbeat. Back then, he was just Arnold George Dorsey, a quiet boy with a stutter and a borrowed dream. He didn't look like someone destined to share whispers with Elvis Presley. He barely looked like someone destined to speak without trembling. But somewhere between the fog-drenched streets of Leicester and the endless static of old radios, he found something that felt like home, a voice that didn't sound like anyone else's. Deep, velvet, warm enough to make silence jealous. His mother said it was a gift. His father said it was a distraction. The neighbors said it was a miracle, that voice pouring out of a boy who once couldn't say his own name without tripping over it. Arnold didn't understand it either. All he knew was that every note that left his throat felt like freedom. Music became the language he could speak without fear. But even freedom has a price, and his would come years later under bright lights and the shadow of another king. By the time he was 20, he had traded his birth name for something showier, Jerry Dorsey, a stage name that sounded like it might fit better on a marquee. He played smoky clubs where the walls sweated whiskey and the piano was always a little out of tune. He sang love songs for people who barely listened, his voice cutting through laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft ache of loneliness that lived in every bar after midnight. He wanted more, but more was expensive. More meant sacrifice. And at the time, he didn't realize how much of himself he'd have to give up to find it. Fate intervened in the strangest way through reinvention. His manager, Gordon Mills, looked at him one day and said, "Jerry Dorsey doesn't sell dreams, but Engelbert Humperdinck might." Arnold laughed. He thought it was a joke. Engelbert Humperdinck, it sounded absurd, like a name too big to fit in a man's mouth, but Mills wasn't joking. "People remember ridiculous things," he said. "Make them say your name even if they laugh when they do." And so he did. When Release Me hit the radio in 1967, it didn't just climb the charts, it stole breath. It stopped the Beatles, dethroned Penny Lane, and made a man from Leicester an overnight legend. The world met Engelbert, but somewhere deep down, Arnold was still there, the stuttering boy watching his reflection on stage, wondering if this was really him. The suits got shinier, the rooms bigger, the crowds louder, but the eyes stayed the same, searching, always searching. Then came Las Vegas, a city that glowed like temptation itself. To Engelbert, it felt like stepping inside a dream someone else had built. Marble lobbies, women with diamonds in their hair, men with cigars instead of smiles. The Riviera, the Flamingo, rooms that pulsed with possibility. He was no longer just performing songs, he was performing himself. The velvet voice, the white tuxedo, the red rose tossed into trembling hands. Every night, a new woman wept. Every night, he bowed a little lower, smiled a little longer. And somewhere between curtain calls, whispers began to rise. "They say he sounds like Elvis." At first he laughed. The comparison felt flattering, impossible even. Elvis Presley was a constellation, a myth wrapped in leather and lightning. Engelbert was just a man with a love song. But as the whispers turned into headlines, something shifted. The British Elvis. The nickname stuck like gum on a shoe. The tabloids ran with it, the agents leaned into it, and suddenly every performance felt like a silent audition for a part he never asked to play. He told himself it didn't matter, that there was room for two kings on the same stage, but the music world doesn't believe in sharing thrones. Behind the glitz, there's always competition, invisible, sharp, and suffocating. Every smile hides a scorecard, every handshake measures applause. The first time Engelbert heard Elvis's name mentioned in a sneer was backstage at the Riviera. A stagehand, old and bitter, muttered, "Elvis won't like this one bit." Engelbert laughed it off. He thought jealousy was part of the job, but that night as he stepped into the spotlight, he caught a glimpse of something or someone in the crowd. A man in black standing in the shadows, arms folded, watching, not clapping, not smiling, just watching. He brushed it off as paranoia. But the next night it happened again, same stance, same stillness, same quiet storm radiating from the dark. By the third night his curiosity twisted into unease. When he asked a technician afterward who it was, the man hesitated. "You really don't know?" Engelbert shook his head. "That's Elvis." It hit him like static, sharp and electric. The king himself had been standing there listening, judging. He tried to act calm, but inside his chest tightened. What did he think? Was he angry, impressed? Did he think I stole something from him? Las Vegas is a small town disguised as an empire, and rumors travel faster than light. Within days, the gossip machines were in full swing. Elvis saw Engelbert's show and walked out. Elvis said he's a copy. Elvis told his crew there's only one king. None of it confirmed, none of it denied, and that silence, that dangerous silence, was worse than any headline. Engelbert tried to push it away, tried to focus on the music, the crowd, the craft, but the ghost of that stare followed him. He started noticing details, the way journalists smirked when they asked about Elvis, the way fans compared their photos side by side, dark hair, sharp jaw, rhinestones. It didn't help that they sometimes shared the same tailor, or that Engelbert's stage presence had that same magnetic pull, that same dangerous blend of sensuality and sadness. And maybe that's what scared Elvis the most. Because for the first time, someone else could make the audience swoon the way he once did. Someone younger, smoother, untouched by scandal. Vegas was big, but not big enough for two idols with the same silhouette. Still, Engelbert never stopped admiring him. He remembered being a teenager, spinning Heartbreak Hotel on a dusty record player, imagining what it felt like to sing to millions. Elvis had given him that dream. He couldn't hate the man who gave him hope, but admiration has a cruel twin insecurity. The more he rose, the more he felt the weight of another man's shadow pressing against his back. One night during a late set at the Flamingo, he found himself staring into the spotlight and thinking about Elvis, wondering what it felt like to be him, to walk into a room and feel the world stop breathing, to carry a name so heavy that you could never set it down. And in that quiet moment, he realized something that chilled him. Maybe the throne wasn't a blessing. Maybe it was a cage. After the show, he sat alone in his dressing room, jacket half unbuttoned, makeup still clinging to his collar. The cheers outside had faded into silence, and the only sound left was the hum of the air conditioner. He poured himself a drink and whispered to the empty room, "What does it take to be remembered?" It wasn't a question for anyone in particular, but somehow he felt like Elvis might have heard it anyway. The next morning, his manager stormed in waving a newspaper. "Another article, another comparison. They're calling you his rival," Mills said, half proud, half worried. "You're both headlining the Strip next week. They want to make it a showdown." Engelbert stared at the headline, "Two Kings Collide in Vegas." "It was good publicity," Mills insisted. "Publicity?" Engelbert repeated quietly, tasting the word like something bitter. Because deep down, he didn't want a rivalry. He wanted respect. He wanted to sing his songs and let the music speak for itself. But in show business, nobody listens to silence. So he smiled for the cameras, shook hands, signed posters, and pretended he wasn't being slowly written into someone else's story. Each night he performed with even more fire, as if trying to outsing a ghost. The spotlight burned hotter, the roses flew farther, the applause grew louder, but behind the scenes the tension coiled tighter. Friends began choosing sides, agents whispered, one producer even told him, "You know, kid, if Elvis sneezes, you catch a cold." It was meant as a joke, it didn't feel like one. The pressure started to twist his performances into something else, not art but survival. He wasn't just singing anymore, he was defending himself. Every note became a plea, "See me for who I am." Then came the invitation, quiet, unexpected. One of Elvis's men, tall, polite, eyes unreadable, approached Engelbert after a show. "The king sends his regards," he said. Engelbert froze. "He's been watching your performances, wants to meet." He nodded, trying to play it cool, but his heart was racing. When? The man smiled. Soon. He barely slept that night. His mind replayed every rumor, every headline, every glance from the crowd. Was it a friendly invitation or a warning? Was Elvis curious or angry? What would he say? What could he say to the man whose shadow had followed him across continents? The following week, every time the stage lights dimmed, Engelbert looked toward the wings, half expecting to see that same dark silhouette again. Sometimes he thought he did. Sometimes he swore he could feel the weight of Elvis's gaze pressing from somewhere unseen. One night after a particularly powerful set, he lingered at the edge of the stage as the curtains fell. The crowd was gone, but he could still hear their echoes, and in that silence he imagined a voice, smooth, southern, unmistakable. "They keep saying we sound alike." He turned sharply, heart-pounding. No one there, just a trick of the mind, but the words stuck like prophecy, because soon he would hear them for real. As the Vegas summer thickened with heat and rumor, Engelbert's name shone bright across the Strip, but inside he felt something else rising, dread. Fame has a strange echo. The louder it gets, the more it reminds you what it can take away. He watched stars burn out faster than light bulbs. He saw men go from adored to forgotten in the span of a season. And in the quiet between shows, he wondered if he'd already met the ghost of his own future. Some nights when he passed the billboard of Elvis's comeback show at the International Hotel, he slowed his car just to stare. The giant portrait, the confident smirk, the curled lips seemed alive, like it was looking right back at him. He rolled down the window, felt the desert wind rush in, and whispered, "You win, king." But even he wasn't sure what he meant. Because deep down, Engelbert knew this wasn't about rivalry anymore. It was about reflection. About what happens when two men built on music and myth find themselves standing at the same crossroads, one still climbing, one already haunted by the summit. That's where their story really began, not in competition, but in connection. In that invisible thread that binds those who live under the same impossible spotlight. And on one fateful night in 1970, inside a Vegas hotel glittering with sin and gold, that thread would tighten. The door would open, and the king himself would step through, not to conquer, not to confront, but to confess. Engelbert didn't know it yet, but that meeting would change everything he thought he knew about fame, about music, and about what it really means to be free. The night he met Elvis Presley didn't begin like a meeting of legends. It began with a knock, a soft, almost hesitant sound against a dressing room door at the International Hotel. Engelbert had just finished his show, the last notes of the last waltz still echoing in his chest, the roses still fresh in the air, their scent tangled with sweat and cologne. He was loosening his tie, half in a dream, when his stage manager poked his head in and said, "Elvis wants a word." For a moment, everything inside him went still. Elvis. The name itself felt unreal, like hearing that a myth wanted to speak. He tried to smile, but his reflection in the mirror gave him away, a flicker of disbelief, fear, maybe even awe. "You're joking," he said quietly. The man just shook his head. "No joke, he's on his way." Time warped after that. The room seemed to shrink. The hum of the fluorescent light grew louder. Every heartbeat sounded like a countdown. Engelbert looked at his own hands, still trembling slightly from the performance, and wondered what he was supposed to say to a man who had already lived every dream he'd ever had. Then the door opened. Elvis Presley didn't walk in like a superstar. He arrived the way a storm does, all presence and pressure. Rhinestone jumpsuit, jet black hair slicked back with gravity-defying confidence, sunglasses on though it was midnight. The kind of aura that made the air feel charged, like you could light a cigarette just by standing near him. Neither of them spoke. For a few seconds they just stared at each other, the silence bending under the weight of two worlds colliding. Then Elvis broke it, his lips curling into that half-smile the world knew by heart. "They keep saying we sound alike," he said, voice low, teasing. "Had to hear it for myself." Engelbert laughed too quickly, too nervously, and tried to find something clever to say. "I've been listening to you since I was a kid. If there's any resemblance, I'll take it as the highest compliment." Elvis tilted his head, studying him. Then he chuckled, the sound deep and warm but tinged with something else, exhaustion maybe, or sadness. "That's funny," he said. "Heard you do release me last week. For a second thought it was one of mine." The tension melted just enough to breathe. Engelbert motioned toward the couch. "You want to sit?" Elvis nodded, removed his glasses, and for the first time, Engelbert saw his eyes, not the dazzling ones from the TV specials, but tired, heavy eyes that had seen too much. He wasn't meeting a rival. He was meeting a man on the edge of his own legend. They talked for an hour, maybe two, about the grind of the road, about managers who called the shots, about the loneliness of applause. Elvis asked if Engelbert ever got tired of pretending to be the man the world expected. Engelbert smiled softly. "Sometimes, but I remind myself it's better than being forgotten." Elvis didn't laugh. He just looked down at his hands and said, "You think so?" That question hung in the room like smoke. It was the first time Engelbert saw the crack in the armor, a glimpse of the man buried beneath the rhinestones. Fame had made him a monument, but it had also made him a prisoner. They talked about the colonel not by name but through sighs and sidesteps. Elvis spoke of long contracts, endless obligations, the kind of loyalty that didn't feel like loyalty anymore. "I signed my freedom away," he said quietly. "Didn't even know it till it was gone." Engelbert wanted to say something, anything to ease the weight of that confession. But what do you tell a man who is the dream? So he just listened. Sometimes that's all one artist can offer another, silence and understanding. As the night wore on, Elvis's mood shifted like a flickering light. One minute he was charming, telling stories about the old days in Memphis. The next he was distant, staring at nothing. "You ever feel like the show, running you instead of the other way around?" he asked. Engelbert nodded. He didn't have to explain. They were both living inside that same invisible machine, loved by millions, owned by few. At some point, Elvis stood up, paced the room, his voice softer now. "They don't see what it takes. The pills, the pressure, the pretending." He rubbed his temples. "Sometimes I just wish I could walk outside, grab a burger, and not have a single soul care who I am." Engelbert smiled sadly. "Maybe one day." Elvis turned, his expression unreadable. "Maybe not." The room went quiet again, the kind of silence that feels sacred, heavy with something unsaid. Then Elvis looked right at him and said, "You're lucky, you still belong to yourself." Engelbert didn't understand it then, but years later he would. They shook hands that night, and for the briefest moment, Engelbert thought he saw relief in Elvis's eyes, like he'd finally met someone who understood the cost of being adored. But behind that relief was a kind of resignation, too. The look of a man who knows the applause isn't enough anymore. When Elvis left the room, the air seemed to follow him. The silence afterward felt almost cruel. Engelbert sat there, still holding the glass of water he'd poured and never touched. He could still smell the faint trace of cologne in the air, like a ghost that refused to leave. For weeks after, Engelbert couldn't shake the conversation. It looped in his mind every night before sleep, Elvis's words, his tone, the flicker of fear behind the charm. Fame wasn't just wearing him down, it was hollowing him out. He started noticing things when he'd run into Elvis again around the circuit, the forced smile, the way his entourage hovered too close, the faint tremor in his hands. There were whispers backstage, quiet enough to be deniable. "The colonel's got him on something. He's not the same anymore. Man looks tired." Engelbert never repeated them, he didn't want to believe it. One evening months later, Elvis showed up unannounced at Engelbert's show, not in disguise this time but openly. Afterward, they met backstage again like old friends. Elvis hugged him tighter than expected. "You sounded good tonight," he said, "real good." "Thanks," Engelbert replied, "you too, you still own Vegas." Elvis smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Vegas owns me." That line never left him, because deep down he knew it wasn't a metaphor. They kept in touch after that sporadically. Late-night calls, half-finished letters. Sometimes Elvis would phone at odd hours just to talk about music or life. Once he called at 3 a.m. and said, "Do you ever wish you could disappear?" Engelbert, half asleep, chuckled and said, "Disappear where?" Elvis didn't answer, he just sighed. "Somewhere quiet, somewhere nobody says my name." There was a pause. Engelbert didn't know what to say. He wanted to comfort him, but the line felt fragile, like one wrong word could shatter it. "You'll get your peace," he said softly, "one day." Elvis's reply was a whisper, "I doubt it." Then the line went dead. From then on, Engelbert began to see the shadow behind the spotlight. He started recognizing it in others too, that thin, tired smile of those who traded everything for adoration. He'd look out over the crowd and feel something strange, gratitude and guilt mixed together, because he still had balance, he still had control. Elvis, he feared, had lost both. Months later, a small envelope arrived at Engelbert's hotel. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a few words scrawled in uneven handwriting. "Don't let them change you, Angel." No signature, just that, but he didn't need one. He kept that note folded in his wallet for years, even after it began to fade. It reminded him that behind every glittering billboard was a man who'd once just wanted to sing. One night, Engelbert confided in a close friend about the encounter. The friend, a fellow musician, laughed. "Elvis, vulnerable, come on man, he's bulletproof." Engelbert didn't argue, but in his heart he knew the truth. The bulletproof ones always break the hardest. By the summer of 1971, Elvis's shows had grown bigger, louder, more theatrical. He wore more rhinestones, added more jumpsuits, demanded more control, and yet Engelbert could tell he was losing himself. The glitz looked heavier now, like armor. Every performance felt like both a victory and a cry for help. Sometimes they'd see each other briefly in passing, and Elvis would grin, crack a joke, maybe ask about Engelbert's mother. But the eyes always gave him away. There was that same clouded look, the one that said, "I'm still here, but not for long." Engelbert tried once to bring it up. "You've got to slow down, man. You can't keep this pace forever." Elvis smiled faintly. "Too late for that, the train's already rolling." He said it so casually, so matter-of-factly, that Engelbert didn't realize how serious it was until much later. That same week, Elvis collapsed backstage during a rehearsal. The headlines chalked it up to exhaustion. Engelbert read it in the paper over breakfast, a chill crawling through his veins. He wanted to call, but something stopped him. Pride maybe, or fear of intruding. That hesitation would haunt him for decades. The next time they spoke, Elvis sounded different. Slower, detached, like he was already halfway gone. "You ever feel like you're just a puppet, man?" he asked suddenly. "A puppet," Engelbert repeated. "Yeah," Elvis said. "You dance when they pull the strings. You smile when they say smile. And when they're done, they just drop you back in the box." Engelbert tried to joke, "Then maybe it's time you cut the strings." There was a long silence on the other end. Then Elvis whispered, "Strings are stronger than you think." After that call, Engelbert sat alone by the hotel window looking out at the desert. The neon lights seemed to mock him, each one flashing another truth he didn't want to face. He realized fame doesn't just elevate you. It isolates you slowly, quietly, until you forget who you were before they loved you. And that's when he began to understand what Elvis had really meant that first night in his dressing room. You still belong to yourself. It wasn't praise, it was envy. When the two men met one last time, it was at a charity gala, brief, crowded, impersonal. Elvis looked thinner, paler, but he smiled warmly. They hugged, posed for a photo, exchanged a few words that didn't need meaning. Before leaving, Elvis leaned close and said something that Engelbert never forgot. "Remember, Angel, the crown's heavier than it looks." Engelbert nodded, smiling back. But later, alone in his hotel room, he finally understood. The crown wasn't made of gold, it was made of expectation, and once you wear it, it never really comes off. That was the night Engelbert stopped seeing Elvis Presley as an icon and started seeing him as a man brilliant, broken, and burning from the inside out. And though he didn't know it then, that conversation, that fragile connection, would become a ghost that followed him for the rest of his life. Because deep down, he sensed the truth. You don't meet someone like Elvis Presley and leave unchanged. You walk away carrying part of his silence with you and a question that never stops echoing. What if the price of being loved by everyone is never being known by anyone? It began with a note, just a few words scribbled in hurried handwriting on hotel stationery. I'm tired, Angel, real tired. If anything happens, don't let them lie. Engelbert read it 3 times before he understood what he was holding. It wasn't a lyric, it wasn't a joke between friends, it was a warning. A goodbye hidden in plain sight. The message came through a stagehand, one of those invisible souls who lived in the neon shadows of Las Vegas, setting up microphones and clearing glasses while legends burned themselves alive on stage. He handed it to Engelbert quietly, almost reverently, and said, "From him." No explanation, no date, just from him. Engelbert folded the paper, tucked it into his breast pocket, and tried to pretend it didn't feel like the end of something. In the weeks that followed, that note became a phantom. He'd be in the middle of a show mid-song and the words would flicker across his mind like subtitles he couldn't turn off. I'm tired, don't let them lie. Who was them, the doctors, the colonel, the world? He couldn't tell. And maybe that's what haunted him most, that sense of helplessness. Because by then he'd seen the cracks spreading across Elvis's golden image, the way fame had turned from crown to cage. The first signs had appeared backstage, whispered through cigarette smoke. Crew members murmured about canceled rehearsals, pills prescribed like candy, hotel rooms locked from the inside. Engelbert would ask gently, "Is he okay?" And they'd always say the same thing. "He's the king, he'll be fine." But the tone carried doubt. And one night after his own show at Caesar's Palace, Engelbert asked a lighting technician who worked both residencies, "Tell me the truth, how's he really doing?" The man's eyes flickered toward the ground. "He's fatting, sir, you can see it when the lights hit him." It's strange how fame disguises decay. On stage, Elvis still looked untouchable, the jumpsuit, the scarf toss, the adoring crowd, but Engelbert knew the performance too well to be fooled. He could see the tremors in the hands, the heavy breathing between verses, the half-second delay before each smile. The king was running out of kingdom. One evening he saw it up close. They'd both been performing in Vegas the same night, and afterward Elvis invited him for a drink. Engelbert expected the usual, a crowded suite, laughter, people orbiting the star. Instead, he found Elvis sitting alone at the piano, hair damp from the stage, his reflection doubled in the lacquered surface. He looked up, smiled faintly, and said, "I still try to play when I can, reminds me I'm human." They talked until dawn, about music, life, their mothers, the loneliness that stalks applause. Elvis spoke softly, his voice thick with fatigue. "They think I'm made of marble," he said, "but marble cracks, you just don't hear it till it breaks." Engelbert didn't know what to say. He offered to take him out of town, maybe a week in the desert, away from the noise. Elvis chuckled and said, "I'd love that, but the colonel wouldn't." That was the moment Engelbert realized something deeper. Elvis wasn't free to walk away. His empire had turned into a leash, and the hands that once lifted him up were now the ones keeping him down. By 1976, the transformation was undeniable. The once magnetic energy that made audiences gasp now felt forced, desperate. Engelbert saw him again that spring, heavier, slower, surrounded by doctors and handlers who spoke for him more than he did. It reminded him of a puppet show where the strings had become chains. Elvis's smile was still there, but it didn't reach the eyes anymore. They spoke briefly backstage at a benefit concert. Elvis leaned against the wall, breathing hard, a towel around his neck. "You ever feel like you're just being used up?" he asked. Engelbert nodded. "All the time." Elvis laughed quietly. "At least you'll know when to stop." That night, Engelbert returned to his hotel suite and wrote a single line in his journal. He's not living anymore. He's being displayed. Then came August of 1977. Engelbert was preparing for another run of shows when the phone rang. A voice on the other end said, flat and clinical, "Elvis Presley is dead." For a few seconds, the world stopped. Not in metaphor, literally stopped. The air froze, the hum of the minibar, the ticking of the clock, everything seemed to pause around that sentence. Engelbert sat down slowly, holding the receiver like it might burn him. The voice kept talking, but he didn't hear it. His mind flashed to that note. If anything happens, don't let them lie. The official story came fast: heart attack, exhaustion, overdose. But Engelbert had seen the truth behind the headlines. The truth wasn't a single event, it was years of erosion. The pills, the pressure, the endless machine that needed the king to keep performing even when the man inside was gone. At the funeral, Engelbert stood quietly near the back. He didn't want to be photographed, didn't want to be part of the spectacle. The air was thick with perfume and grief. People sobbed as though they were mourning a god, but Engelbert wasn't crying, not yet. He was angry. Angry at the system, the handlers, the silence. Angry at himself for not picking up the phone that one night when Elvis had called and left no message. Angry because he knew what nobody wanted to say. The world didn't just lose him, it consumed him. That night in his hotel room, he unfolded the note again. The paper was creased and thin, but the ink hadn't faded. Don't let them lie. He pressed it flat on the table, staring at it for hours as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less painful. He didn't sleep. Instead, he wrote page after page of memories, confessions, regrets, about the way Elvis's laugh filled a room, about the haunted look he wore when the lights went out, about the sound of his voice when he said, "You're lucky, Angel, you still belong to yourself." Somewhere around dawn, Engelbert closed the notebook and whispered, "I should have done more." But deep down, he knew he couldn't have saved him. No one could. Elvis hadn't just been dying of pills or pressure. He'd been dying of expectation, of being trapped in a legend too large to escape. Weeks later, a backup singer who had worked with both men approached Engelbert backstage in Reno. Her eyes were swollen, her hands trembling as she lit a cigarette. "I can't keep quiet anymore," she said. "He wasn't just sick, they made him that way." "What do you mean?" he asked. "They kept him sedated," she whispered. "The colonel, the doctors, easier to control that way. He asked questions when he was clear, so they kept him cloudy." Engelbert felt something twist inside him, rage mixed with disbelief. "You're saying they wanted him that way?" She nodded. He was worth more broken than rebellious. The words hit like a punch. He wanted to call her a liar, but the truth was he'd already suspected as much. He'd seen the same hollow eyes on other stars, the ones who dared to slow down to say no. Fame, he realized, wasn't a spotlight, it was a furnace, and Elvis had burned longer than anyone. That night, Engelbert added another note to his journal. The king didn't fall. He was lowered slowly by hands pretending to hold him up. In the months that followed, he could barely perform. The stage lights felt too bright, too cruel. When he finally returned, he added a new song, an unannounced ballad with no lyrics, just music mournful and haunting. He played it every night, alone under a single spotlight, a silent tribute to the friend he couldn't save. Audiences didn't know who it was for. They didn't have to, they felt it. The ache, the apology, the guilt wrapped in melody. But behind that grief lived something darker, a question that refused to die. What had Elvis meant by "Don't Let Them Lie"? Was it about the cause of his death, the manipulation behind his fame, or something deeper, a truth buried with him inside Graceland's walls? Years passed and Engelbert tried to move on. But every now and then he'd catch himself watching an old performance of Elvis on TV, the Vegas years, the jumpsuits, the sweat, the hollow grin. And he'd whisper under his breath, "They're still lying, brother, they're still lying." He began hearing rumors, strange ones. Stories of missing medical records, hush agreements, files sealed for decades. Some dismissed them as conspiracy theories. Engelbert didn't. He'd seen too much to call it coincidence. Once in the late 80s, he visited Graceland privately after hours. No tourists, no press, just him and the stillness of a house that had outlived its master. As he walked the hallway to the staircase, he stopped. For a moment, he could swear he heard something, faint music maybe, or a whisper. Then silence. He didn't go upstairs, he couldn't. That space felt sacred and violated all at once. Instead, he stood at the bottom and whispered, "You deserved better." People often asked him in interviews what he thought killed Elvis. Engelbert would smile sadly and say, "Fame given to the wrong hands." But what he meant was simpler: neglect, the kind disguised as care, the kind that feeds you pills and calls it help. And yet beneath the sadness there was something else too: guilt. Not because he'd done something wrong, but because he hadn't done enough right. He'd had chances, calls he didn't return, visits he postponed, words he swallowed because he didn't want to offend a myth. Now the myth was gone and the man had been forgotten. He often replayed their last conversation, the one where Elvis said, "You'll know when to stop." Back then, Engelbert thought it was a compliment. Now it sounded like prophecy. He did stop, not from exhaustion, but from reflection. Each show became less about applause and more about remembrance. He told his band to dim the lights at the end of the set, just enough so the audience could barely see him. "That's how he left," Engelbert said quietly, half in shadow. He never showed anyone the note, not for decades. It stayed locked in a small box with a few photographs and a gold cufflink Elvis once gave him. When asked in interviews about his memories of the king, he'd smile, say something kind, and steer away from the pain. But late at night, when the crowd noise had faded and the room was still, he'd take the box out, unfold that paper, and whisper the words again. "Don't let them lie." The older he got, the more those words felt like a mission. Not to expose scandal, but to tell the truth that Elvis Presley was human, that behind the myth was a man who laughed, doubted, dreamed, and broke. A man who gave everything and got caged in return. Engelbert never sought to be his defender, but he became his witness. Because sometimes the only justice the dead receive is remembrance, told by those brave enough to remember them honestly. And so, every time he stepped onto a stage afterward, he'd pause for a moment before the first note, close his eyes, and say silently, "This one's for you, brother." The lights would rise, the music would begin, and somewhere between the first verse and the final applause, he could almost feel him again. Not the king of rock and roll, not the icon, but the man at the piano, barefoot and weary, whispering his final truth. "You still belong to yourself." And that reminder, that fragile echo of freedom, became the only thing that kept Engelbert singing long after the curtain fell. By the time Engelbert turned 89, time itself felt like an accomplice to silence. The world had moved on, its headlines written, its heroes buried, its myths neatly packaged for documentaries and nostalgia reels. But somewhere deep inside him, a quiet ache refused to fade. It wasn't just grief anymore, it was unfinished business. The kind that hums beneath the surface of every applause, every memory, every night he still dared to step on stage. He sat in a small London studio one winter morning, the kind of gray, bone-chilling day that makes every breath visible. A young interviewer across from him shuffled his notes, nervous. "Mr. Humperdinck," he began softly, "you've spoken about Elvis with great respect all your life, but you've also hinted there are things you've never said. Do you want to clarify any of that today?" For a moment, Engelbert didn't move. He just looked past the camera as if searching for something on the other side of memory. Then he smiled faintly and said, "You know, there were nights Elvis called me and I didn't pick up." His voice cracked, not from age but from regret. "I thought I'd call him back the next day, but sometimes there isn't a next day." The room went silent. The interviewer lowered his pen. It was the kind of confession that didn't need explanation, the kind that carried years inside a single breath. Engelbert looked down at his hands, the veins like fragile rivers, and whispered, "He wasn't calling to talk about music. He was saying goodbye and I didn't hear it." That line echoed in the studio, heavy and human. It wasn't guilt in his voice, it was something quieter, understanding, maybe even forgiveness. Because with time he'd come to see that no one could have saved Elvis from what he was fighting. The tragedy wasn't that he died young. It was that he died unseen, surrounded by people who loved his fame more than his soul. When the cameras turned off, Engelbert stayed seated. The crew began packing up, cables coiling like snakes on the floor, and still he didn't move. Then, almost to himself, he said, "There were things he told me that never left me, things I didn't believe until now." The producer glanced at him. "Like what?" He leaned back slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. He said he felt watched. The word hung there, chilling in its simplicity, watched. He told them how Elvis would phone late at night, sometimes whispering as though someone might be listening. He'd talk about people moving through the house after dark, said he'd see shadows near the staircase. "Once he told me, 'They watch the stairs, Angel, they don't want me going down.'" The interviewer frowned. "You think he meant that literally?" Engelbert's eyes softened. "At the time I didn't, now I'm not so sure." He went on to describe how years later he'd been invited to Graceland after Elvis's passing. The house was quiet, preserved like a shrine, but when he stood in the upstairs hallway, the one forever closed to the public, something felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, almost electric. "I stood outside the bathroom door," he said slowly. "The one where they say it happened, but it didn't feel like a place of peace. It felt interrupted." He didn't elaborate, he didn't need to. For decades, Engelbert had avoided the word conspiracy. He didn't believe in ghosts or cover-ups or the sensational tales that fans spun out of grief. But as he got older, patterns began to align in ways he couldn't ignore. The withheld medical records, the financial games, the handlers who'd vanished into obscurity. "It wasn't one lie," he said once in a late-night interview. "It was 1,000 small ones, and together they built the perfect story to bury the truth." He didn't accuse anyone by name, he didn't have to. Because what he was really exposing wasn't murder, it was neglect, polished to look like destiny. Even now, when he performed, the ghosts followed him. Before every show, he'd stand backstage, waiting for the cue, and whisper the same words under his breath. "This one's for you, brother." Sometimes he swore he could feel it, the faint warmth of presence like a hand on his shoulder. He'd step onto the stage, the lights blazing white, and in that instant he was young again. The voice returned. The velvet, the vibrato, the romance. And somewhere in the middle of the song, as the crowd swayed and time blurred, he'd feel Elvis beside him, not the legend but the man. Barefoot, laughing, free. People always asked him why he kept performing at his age. Why keep chasing the stage when he'd already conquered it? And Engelbert would smile, a sad, knowing smile. "Because every time I sing," he'd say, "I feel like I'm giving him another minute." There's a strange irony in outliving your rival, your friend, your reflection. The world had crowned Elvis as immortal, yet here was Engelbert, flesh, bone, and heartbeat, still carrying the weight of his memory. He used to think longevity was a blessing. Now he understood it as something else entirely, survival as punishment, because surviving means remembering, and remembering means never really resting. Sometimes, when he couldn't sleep, he'd sit by the window with a glass of whiskey and stare at the moon. He'd think about that night backstage when Elvis walked into his dressing room for the first time, how alive he looked, how heavy he sounded. "They keep saying we sound alike," Elvis had joked. But what Engelbert realized now, all these years later, was that they didn't sound alike, they felt alike. Two men chasing the same impossible perfection, two men trapped by their own brilliance. He once told a journalist, "Fame doesn't kill you all at once. It drains you piece by piece until the man in the mirror is a stranger wearing your smile." And when he said it, he wasn't talking about Elvis anymore. During his final US tour, he visited Memphis quietly without press or fanfare. After the show, he asked his driver to take him to Graceland, not to the gates but to the back road near the property line where the woods pressed close against the fence. He got out, hands trembling slightly, and just stood there in the dark. The mansion's lights glowed faintly in the distance, a ghostly silhouette against the Tennessee night. "You're free now," he whispered. "I hope you found the peace they wouldn't let you have here." The driver, unsure what to say, stayed silent. Engelbert smiled faintly, as if hearing something no one else could. "He's still singing," he said. "Not for us this time, for himself." That night he went back to his hotel and found a letter waiting for him from a fan. A woman who'd attended nearly every one of his shows for 40 years. Inside was a faded photograph of Elvis and Engelbert side by side at a charity gala, laughing like schoolboys. On the back she'd written, "Legends never die. They just wait for someone brave enough to tell the truth." He stared at that line for a long time, his throat tight, because maybe that's all this was. Not vengeance, not revelation, just truth. The kind whispered too late but spoken nonetheless. In his final years, Engelbert began donating quietly to addiction charities, to organizations that helped performers regain control over their own lives. "If I can give one artist the freedom he never had," he said once, "then maybe that's how I make peace with it." He stopped doing big interviews after that. No more tabloid headlines, no more speculation, just music, pure, stripped-down, intimate. In his last televised performance, he ended the show by singing an old Elvis favorite, "Can't Help Falling in Love." His voice cracked on the final note, and for a moment it sounded less like a performance and more like a prayer. When the lights dimmed, he stayed on stage a few seconds longer, whispering something the microphones barely caught. Later, fans swore they could hear it in the footage. "Thank you for the song, my friend." Afterward, as he walked off stage, a journalist waiting by the wings asked, "Is that how you want to be remembered? As the man who kept his promise to Elvis?" Engelbert smiled. "No," he said, "as the man who finally told his story right." And with that, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only the echo of a truth 50 years in the making. A truth that was never meant to destroy the legend, but to humanize it, to remind the world that even kings can be prisoners, and even fame can sound a lot like loneliness. Because in the end, it wasn't about rivalry or regret or redemption. It was about recognition. Two men who'd lived under impossible lights, each searching for the same small, ordinary thing, peace. Maybe that's why Engelbert finally spoke after all those years, not to expose Elvis, but to free himself from the silence that had kept them both chained long after the applause had died. Some truths don't fade, they wait, and when time finally catches up, they speak through whoever still remembers the sound. And maybe that's the real story, how the greatest voices in the world often sang through their pain, never realizing we were listening to confessions disguised as melodies. Engelbert's truth isn't just about Elvis. It's about every artist who gave too much, every legend who learned too late that applause can't heal a soul. Do you think Elvis ever found peace in the end, or was freedom something he never got to hold? Tell me what you believe in the comments below. Because some stories don't end when the music stops, they echo. And if you don't want to miss the next hidden truth behind the curtain, subscribe now so you're here when we uncover the next chapter, the next voice, the next secret the world was never supposed to hear. The truth isn't gone, it's just waiting for someone brave enough to listen.